Welcome to the Nebraska Department of Education's Buy American provision for the National School Lunch Program. I am Katie Parch, Director of the Child Nutrition Programs, and I will present the training for you today. The Buy American provision, which is written into the program regulations for the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs, supports healthy school meals, domestic agriculture, and farm to school. This provision requires schools to maximize their purchases of domestically produced menu items and sets a cap on the dollar value of non-domestic purchases represented as a percentage of total food purchases. The cap begins at 10% and over the course of several school years decreases to 8% and finally lands at a 5% cap. After completing this training, you will be able to explain the Buy American provision, understand the two exceptions to the Buy American provision, and execute the documentation requirements for the provision, including submission of an accommodation request when needed. In order to support compliance with the Buy American provision, it's important to understand that record keeping and communication with a school business manager and others is essential for complying with this requirement. Understanding and knowledge of the food purchase budget for your school, as well as expenditures, is absolutely required in order to support your school's compliance with this requirement. The Buy American provision is essential for the National School Lunch Program. It includes updates to regulatory requirements, including a definition of the word substantially, which is defined as 51% or more of the ingredients used in a food product have been produced in the U.S., and also goes on to include and update procurement provisions for Buy American, indicating that the Buy American requirement must be included in all procurement that school food authorities do to purchase their food items for lunch and breakfast. As mentioned earlier, we are beginning with a 10% cap on non-domestic purchases in school year 2025-26. Over time, we will decrease to an 8% cap beginning in school year 2028-29, and finally land at a 5% non-domestic purchase cap beginning in school year 2031-32. The updated Buy American provision includes two limited exceptions to the requirement to purchase domestically produced items. The first of those is that the food product is listed on the Federal Acquisitions Regulations Non-Available Articles list, found at 48 CFR 25.104. This exception counts toward the allowable percent of non-domestic purchases. Even though these items are not produced domestically, they must still be included in determining whether your school is compliant with the non-domestic purchase cap applicable for any given school year. These exceptions must be documented and may be subject to an accommodation request process, and we'll cover more on that process later. You can access the non-available articles list using the QR code on this slide. This slide displays a snip of the non-available articles list, and we used it to highlight some of the common items that you may serve in your school breakfast or lunch programs that could be on the list and therefore not produced domestically. We see on the first page that there are already 3 items that could be commonly menued in your school nutrition programs, including bananas, coconut, and grapefruit. Again, even though these items are not produced domestically, they do still count toward whether your school is compliant with the non-domestic purchase cap. The second of the 2 exceptions to the Buy American provision requirements to purchase domestically produced items is for price. If your SFA conducts price comparisons or competitive bids that reveal the cost of the U.S. product is significantly higher than the non-domestic food product, this is an allowable purchase outside of the Buy American requirements. Like the other exception we discussed, which would be for foods not produced domestically, this exception for non-domestically produced foods that are much less expensive than the domestic version must count toward the allowable percent of non-domestic purchases. And these exceptions must be documented and may be subject to the accommodation request process, which again we will describe more later. There are several common and widely used examples of non-domestic food products, including fruit juices, spices, conditioned yeast, as well as some fruits and vegetables that may be present in mixed fruit and vegetable items. In order for school food authorities to comply with the Buy American provisions non-domestic cap, they must use the USDA's Buy American tracking form, and you see a picture of that on the slide. Each row should be used to designate any non-domestic food item purchased for use in the school nutrition program. Each item purchased should have its own row and should include other details for that purchase, including the cost of the item purchased. Use of the Buy American tracking form is required, and the Buy American exception form, which used to be in place and used by the NDE, is now retired. You can find the Buy American tracking form with the other Buy American provision information, training, and resources available on the NDE Nutrition Services website. The Buy American tracking form also requires that you identify the exception type that you are using for every non-domestic purchase. The exception type column has a drop-down menu that allows you to select from exception 1 or exception 2. In addition to accessing the Buy American tracking form from the NDE Nutrition Services website, you can also access and download the form using the QR code displayed on this slide. The Buy American provision for school year 25-26 will be used to establish a baseline value of your school's non-domestic purchases. The information you gather this year with tracking your non-domestic purchases should be used to inform your school about its non-domestic purchasing habits, as well as provide an opportunity to work with your suppliers and vendors in order to make adjustments for the forthcoming reduction in the non-domestic purchase cap. With documentation, SFAs may exceed the school year 25-26 threshold of 10% on its non-domestic purchases with foods that meet the 2 exception criteria that we discussed earlier. Those are that there are no domestic options for those foods available, and that the price of the domestic option is much too high compared to the non-domestic version of that food. In the case that a school understands or believes it will not be able to comply with the 10% non-domestic food purchase cap, the school must do 3 things. First, it should submit an accommodation request form and receive NDE approval. Second, the school must make meaningful progress toward the prescribed 10% non-domestic purchase threshold, and the school should work with the NDE to come into compliance with the non-domestic cap. When it comes to submitting the accommodation request after a school recognizes it will not be able to comply with the 10% cap, it must submit the accommodation request just one time during school year 25-26. And do that request only after forecasting for purchases reveals that the SFA will exceed the 10% non-domestic purchase cap. This request should include all details for all non-domestic component items purchased that contributed to exceeding the 10% cap. Remember, we do not want schools to submit an accommodation request for every non-domestic purchase. Your school should submit one request for the duration or entirety of school year 25-26 and should make that request as detailed and comprehensive as possible. Let's take a closer look at some common questions about what items are included in the calculation to determine compliance with the non-domestic purchase cap. USDA foods, also known as commodities or donated foods, are not commercial purchases. Therefore, the value of these foods is not included in the calculation to determine a school's compliance with the non-domestic purchase cap. Items used in the Fresh Fruit Vegetable Program, or FFVP, are also not included in the non-domestic purchase cap calculation. Similarly, foods purchased for use in the After-School Care Snack Program are also not included in a school's calculation to determine compliance with the 10% non-domestic cap. Let's review the Buy American basics we've covered so far in the training. All foods used in the school lunch and breakfast programs that were not produced in the United States must be included in the calculation of the non-domestic cap. You can access the non-available articles list at 48 CFR 25.104. Your school must document all non-domestic purchases in the USDA's Buy American tracking tool. USDA foods are not commercial purchases, so will not be included in the non-domestic cap calculation. In addition to tracking all non-domestic purchases using the USDA's Buy American tracking tool, schools are also required to submit a request for accommodation if they cannot comply with the 10% cap on non-domestic purchases. This accommodation request should be submitted only if the school determines it will exceed the 10% cap in school year 25-26. Please remember to submit the accommodation form only once. This single submission should reflect all meal components that are affected, including the specific examples of those foods within each component group that your school is purchasing non-domestically for one of the two exception reasons, including its non-availability and its existence on the non-available articles list, or that a price comparison demonstrated that the domestic version is exceptionally more expensive than the non-domestic version. For school year 25-26, the NDE is accepting only the electronic accommodation request, which will be available on the Nutrition Services website alongside the other Buy American provision resources and this training. The NDE will not accept any paper submissions. We are responsible for aggregating and reporting accommodation request information. And in order to streamline this process and make it efficient, we can accept only electronic submissions that will populate spreadsheets that will help us aggregate and report information. The electronic Buy American accommodation request form will require that schools report their full school name and the 6-digit agreement number that appears in the upper left screen of the CNP system after you log in. We also request the school contacts and their email addresses, as well as identification of the category of the foods in the accommodation request. The form also requires a written explanation or reason for the request, as well as an explanation of your school's effort and the timeline that will be used to come into compliance with the Buy American provision threshold. Let's review these important tracking for compliance steps that schools must take. First, schools must track all non-domestic purchases, including invoice details like the date of the purchase, the item purchased, the source of that item, the amount or quantity purchased, as well as the cost in that non-domestic tracking sheet. As your school is tracking all of its non-domestic purchases, it will need to frequently assess whether it's in compliance with the 10% non-domestic cap. The answer to that will determine whether the accommodation request needs to be submitted to the NDE. So logically, you're going to ask yourself, is my school on a trajectory to exceed the 10% cap? If the answer to that is yes, then you would need to submit a single Buy American accommodation request that includes all the details for all of your non-domestic purchases. The Buy American provision now includes requirements for schools' procurement methods. SFAs must include the Buy American provision and its requirements in the procurement procedures, solicitations, and contracts it uses in the school nutrition programs. The Buy American requirements must be included in all methods of procurement, including micro purchases, small purchases, and formal purchases that use a request for proposal or invitation for bid. Finally, Buy American provision requirements and the associated regulations must be written into all contracts that schools use for their school nutrition program purchases for food. This slide shows an example of Buy American provision language used in a solicitation. As you can see, it clearly cites the federal regulation for the Buy American provision and clearly states the two exceptions under which the Buy American provision does not have to be followed for making non-domestic purchases. The Buy American provision updates also now include guidance for the purchase of fish used in the school nutrition programs. It indicates that farmed fish must be harvested within the U.S. or any territory or possession of the U.S. The QR code you see on the slide provides information about which locations are territories or possessions of the United States. Guidance for wild-caught fish indicates it must be harvested within the exclusive economic zone of the U.S. or by a U.S. flagged vessel. In order to support compliance with the Buy American provision for school year 25-26 and beyond, the NDE encourages you to ask a few questions of your suppliers. First of all, ensure they are aware of the Buy American provision's 10% cap. Then ask them how the supplier will support your compliance by providing you with the necessary documentation for domestic and non-domestic purchases. Related, ask them what documentation they will provide to help you track your non-domestic purchases. Will that information include identifying the origin in a seasonality chart for produce, perhaps? Or will they identify the item's origin on every invoice? For example, grain items may have additional ingredients, like a pizza dough mix. For this type of item, the supplier must be able to identify all the ingredients in the pizza dough, as well as the origination of each of those ingredients. There are a few questions you should ask yourself as well. Think of your top 3 non-domestic menu items, the ones you purchase the most often or at the greatest dollar value. About those, ask yourself, would a non-domestic version be available using a different supplier? Is it possible for you to swap a non-domestic item for something that's produced locally? The NDE has wonderful resources to support domestic purchases, even purchases that are produced within the state of Nebraska or surrounding states. We encourage you to utilize the Nebraska Thursdays and Harvest of the Month resources in order to support your compliance with the Buy American provision's non-domestic purchase cap. You also need to ask yourself, how will I provide this information for my non-domestic purchases to others at my school who may be supportive in ensuring our compliance with this provision? How can you initiate communication with others at your school to support compliance with the provision? As we mentioned at the top of the training, that communication between different positions or people who have a stake in ensuring your school's compliance is essential. As we close out the training on the Buy American provision for school year 25-26, let's recap some of those important things to remember and do. Every school must track all of its non-domestic purchases using the USDA's Buy American provision tracker. Every school's goal should be to stay at or beneath the 10% non-domestic cap for purchases. If a school cannot comply with the 10% non-domestic cap, it must submit an accommodation request form electronically to the NDE and must demonstrate its effort to adjust its purchasing in order to become compliant with the cap in future years. If you have questions about the Buy American provision or any other school nutrition programs, rules, or regulations, please access our contact list for the school lunch program specialists using the link on this slide.